turn denounced her detractors, and the controversy escalated. In 1638, the Bay Colony government then expelled Hutchinson and her followers for sedition. She settled briefly in Rhode Island before moving on to Long Island, where she later on died as a result of an Indian attack. If Anne Hutchinson had been a man, her ideas would still have been deemed heretical. However, if she had been a man, she might have found other ways to express her intelligence and magnetism. But life in colonial New England offered women, especially married women, little scope for their talents. And it is the subject of women in New England that we'll turn to now when we discuss the witchcraft trials. Most adult women were hard-working farm wives who cared for large households of children. Between marriage and middle age, most New England wives were pregnant except when breastfeeding. When they were not nursing or minding children, mothers were producing and preparing much of what was consumed and worn by their families. They planted vegetable gardens and pruned fruit trees. They salted beef and pork, pressed cider, milked cows, churned butter, kept bees, and tended poultry, cooked and baked, washed and ironed, spun and wove, and also sewed. While husbands and sons engaged in farm work that changed with the seasons, took trips to taverns and mills, and went off to hunt and fish. Housebound wives and daughters were locked into a humdrum routine with little time for themselves. Women suffered legal disadvantages as well. In contrast to New Mexico and Florida with the Spanish and civil law traditions, English common law and colonial legal codes accorded married women virtually no control over their property. Wives could not sue or be sued. They could not make contracts. They they had to surrender to their husbands any property that they possessed before marriage. Divorce was almost impossible to obtain until the late 18th century. Only widows and a few single men had the same property rights as men, but they could not vote in any colonial elections. The one arena in which women could attain something approaching equal standing with men was within the churches. Puritan women could not become ministers, but after the 1660s, they made up the majority of church members. In some churches, membership enabled them to vote for ministerial candidates and to voice opinions about admitting certain members into the ranks of their church. Puritan doctrine itself rejected medieval Catholic suspicion of women as a necessary evil, seeing them instead as a necessary good. Even so, the Puritan ideal of the virtuous woman was a chaste, submissive helpmeet, a wife and a mother who served God by serving men. Communities sometimes responded to assertive women with accusations of witchcraft, as historians have showed, and a lot of popular history has poorly shown in their portrayal of the witchcraft trials which took place throughout the New England region from February 1692 to May 1693. Like most early modern Europeans, New Englanders believed in wizards and witches, men and women who were said to acquire supernatural powers by signing a compact with Satan. A total of 344 New Englanders were charged with witchcraft during the first colonial century, with the notorious Salem witchcraft trial accusations of 1692-1693 producing the largest outpouring of accusations and 20 executions. More than 3/4 of all accused witches were women, usually middle-aged and older, and most of those accused were regarded as unduly independent. Before they were charged with witchcraft, many had been suspected of heretical religious beliefs, like Anne Hutchinson, others of sexual improprieties, and others had inherited or stood to inherited property. And all of these factors cater to a large part of individuals claiming them to be, or deciding that they would voice an opinion that these women were witches. So in effect, it was like a social reaction, a fear of this very awkward position of certain women within society that was one major factor in the events that led to the witchcraft trials. Let's now turn to the Mid-Atlantic or Middle colonies. The inhabitants of the Mid-Atlantic colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, enjoyed more secure lives than did most southern colonies. But they lacked the common bonds that lent stability to early New England. Instead, throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, a variety of ethnic and religious groups vied for wealth from farming and fur trade, and contended bitterly against governments that commanded little popular support. By the 1660s, the Dutch experiment on the Mid-Atlantic coast, as I've referenced in previous lectures, was faltering. While Fort Orange continued to secure furs for the Dutch from the Iroquois, the colonial population remained small and fragmented. The company made matters worse by appointing corrupt dictatorial governors who ruled without an elective assembly. It also provided little protection for outlying Dutch settlements. When it did attack neighboring Indian nations, it did so savagely, triggering terrible retaliations. When the West India Company went bankrupt in 1654, it had all but virtually abandoned its American colonies. Taking advantage of the disarray of New Netherlands, Charles II, King of England, ignored Dutch claims in North America and granted his brother James, the Duke of York, a proprietary charter there. The charter granted James all of New Netherlands and the Delaware Bay, as well as Maine, Martha's Vineyard, and the Nantucket Island. In 1664, James sent an invading fleet, whose mere arrival caused the Dutch to surrender. New York's diversity, however, would make it difficult to govern. The Duke inherited 9,000 or so colonists in 1664 that consisted of Dutch, Belgian, French, English, Portuguese, Swede, Finnish, and African peoples of descent. Some enslaved, others were free. The colony's ethnic diversity ensured a variety of religions. Although the Dutch Reformed Church predominated, other early New Netherlanders included Lutherans, Quakers, and Catholics. Religious and political individualism, similar to that of Puritans, inspired the colonization of another Mid-Atlantic colony called Pennsylvania, making it an oddity among the Mid-Atlantic colonies. The oddity began with the improbable founder of the colony, William Penn. Young Penn devoted his early years to disappointing his distinguished father in England, Sir William Penn, an admiral in the Royal Navy. Several years after being expelled from college, young Penn finally chose a career that may have made the admiral or his father yearn for mere disappointment. He undertook a lifelong commitment to put into practice Quaker teachings. Now, just to refresh, or just to give you a description or definition of Quakers, they were a Protestant sect, also known as the Society of Friends, and they were founded in the mid-17th century. The Quakers believed that the Holy Spirit dealt with each human being, and that religious conviction was the source of their egalitarian social practices, which included allowing women to speak in churches and to preach in public gatherings. Needless to say, the Quakers were considered to be radical as well. By the 1670s, William Penn the Younger had emerged as an acknowledged leader of the Society of Friends, or the Quakers. The Quakers behaved in ways and believed in ideas that most people regarded as odd. They dressed in a deliberately plain and severe manner. They withheld from their social superiors the customary marks of respects, such as bowing or kneeling or removing their hats when they went into a home. They refused to swear oaths to make war. They allowed women public roles of religious leadership. That pattern of behavior reflected their egalitarian ideas, the belief that all men and women shared equally in the light from the light within, or the Great Spirit. Some 40,000 English merchants, artisans, and farmers embraced Quakerism by the 1660s, and many suffered fines, imprisonment, and corporal punishment, much like their Puritan counterparts. Since the English upper class had always prized, oddly enough, since the English upper class has always prized eccentricity among its members, it is somewhat surprising that Penn, despite his Quakerism, remained a favorite of King Charles II. More surprising, though, is that the king's favor took the extravagant form of presenting Penn in 1681 with all the land between New Jersey and Maryland. Perhaps the king was repaying Penn for a large sum of money that his father had lent his family, that is, the king's family. Or perhaps the king was hoping to export England's Quakers to an American colony governed by a trusted and personal friend. Regardless, Penn envisioned that his proprietary colony would provide a refuge for Quakers while producing quit rents for himself. To publicize his colony, he distributed pamphlets praising its attractions throughout the British Isles and throughout Europe. The response was overwhelming. By 1700, its population, that is the population of Pennsylvania, stood at 21,000. The only early migration of equal magnitude was the Puritan colonization of New England. Pennsylvania, as noted on the slide, marked another holy experiment then in the colonies, that is the northeast colonies of New England as well as the middle colonies. These two lectures have quickly summarized some of the generalities with reference to the founding of the northeast colonies as well as the southern colonies during the 17th and early parts of the 18th century. The third and final installment of the lecture series today will address increasing conflict, that is, the increasing conflict not only between colonists and Indians, but also rivals for the continent, that is, the French and the British. And we will turn to that in just a few minutes. For reference, I have also included in this slide a breakdown of both the New England colonies, middle colonies, and southern colonies. I realize due to time limitations, I am unable to essentially tell the story of the founding of every single colony, that later, as we all know, become states. So what I've done is I've placed a slide up here for your reference. This slide references the founding date of the different colonies, as well as the reasons why they were founded. I hope this is helpful, and like I mentioned, we will now turn to the third segment of today's lectures that deals with imperialism and the competition for empire.